What would you do if you had nothing left but a handful of coins and a grief as wide as the Texas sky? If your whole world had been burned away in the fever of war, and all that remained was the dust on your boots and a choice? For Hattie Mercer, a widow at 22 in the long, hot summer of 1876, that choice came down to $3 silver. She spent them all on a boarded-up, forgotten general store in a town the railroad had decided to let die. Everyone called her a fool. They saw a derelict building, a final, desperate mistake. But the truth waiting inside, nailed shut behind a wall of secrets, was something more than treasure. It was a reckoning. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of a woman who bought a ruin and found the foundation of a town. We'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. The heat shimmered off the single dusty street of Renner, Texas, making the air itself look tired. Hattie Mercer stood before the county clerk's office, the deed clutched in her hand. The paper was crisp, official, but it felt as flimsy as a dried leaf. $3. It was the last of the money her husband Daniel had sent home before the letter came bearing a stranger's handwriting and the cold, formal condolences of the United States Army. She could feel the ghost of the coins in her palm, the memory of their weight. One for the land, one for the building, one for the dust and the memories trapped inside. The clerk, a man with a stained vest and weary eyes, hadn't even bothered to hide his pity. "It's yours, ma'am," he'd said, pushing the paper across the counter. "What's left of it?" Hattie walked the 50 yards from the clerk's office to her new property, the Renner General Store and Mercantile. The sign, hanging from one rusted hinge, still bore the name, but the paint had been scoured away by sun and sand until it was just a pale whisper against the graying wood. The windows were boarded over with planks of mismatched timber, and the porch sagged with a deep, weary sigh, as if it had given up on holding anything at all. It was more a tombstone than a building, a monument to a town's broken promise. Renner had been on the proposed route for the new railway line, a place of bustling hope for a few short years. But the surveyors had found cheaper, flatter land 10 miles to the south, and just like that, the town's lifeblood had been diverted. Now it was a place of endings, not beginnings. She remembered Daniel talking about this store. On their last Sunday together, sitting on the porch of their small farm, he'd spoken of it. "Old man Renner," he'd said, "he sees everything, writes it all down, says a town's soul is in its ledgers." He'd laughed then, a sound she could still conjure if she closed her eyes tight. Daniel had been dead 2 years now, but his memory was the one possession she had left that felt solid. It was his voice that had whispered to her when she saw the notice for the store being sold for back taxes. It felt like a message, a last piece of him left in the world for her to find. She ran a calloused finger over the rusted key in her pocket. It was heavy, ornate, and likely hadn't turned the lock in a decade. A group of men sitting in the shade of the saloon porch across the street watched her, their silence a form of judgment. Hattie ignored them. She had spent her last dollar not on food, not on a ticket to somewhere else, but on this place of forgetting. She had to believe there was a reason. The key wouldn't turn. It grated in the lock, a dry metallic scream of protest. Hattie put her shoulder to the door, pushing with all her thin frame could muster. The wood groaned, but held fast. She was alone, with a locked door to a life she wasn't sure she could build, in a town that had already surrendered. The sun beat down on her bonnet, and for a moment, the weight of her grief and the folly of her purchase threatened to buckle her knees. She had traded the last remnants of her old life for a pile of rotting wood and shattered dreams. What in God's name had she done? The building stood before her, a silent, stubborn testament to decay. The Renner General Store was an icon of the town's slow surrender. its faded lettering a ghostly reminder of a commerce that had long since fled south with the promise of the railroad. Hattie saw it not just as wood and nails, but as a reflection of her own hollowed-out heart. It was empty, forgotten, and left for dead. And now, it was hers. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and sun-baked earth, and tried the key again. It was useless. The lock was a solid lump of rust. Stepping back, she surveyed the boarded-up windows, the sagging porch roof, the profound stillness of the place. It looked impenetrable. From across the street, the men on the saloon porch murmured to each other, their curiosity turning to quiet amusement. A woman, and a slip of one at that, trying to resurrect a corpse. She walked the perimeter, her boots kicking up small puffs of ochre dust. The wood of the walls was silvered with age, cracked and splintered like old bone. In the back, an alley choked with tumbleweeds and broken crates led to a heavy rear door, just as firmly sealed as the front. It was here she found her first small victory. A single window, its boards loosened by a season of wind and rain, offered a sliver of hope. Using the heel of her boot, she kicked at the lowest plank. It groaned, then splintered, falling inward with a dusty crash. It was enough. She pulled herself through the narrow opening, scraping her hands on the rough wood, and dropped into the profound and absolute darkness inside. The air was thick, motionless, a cocktail of scents a decade in the making. Dried herbs, rust, decaying paper, and the faint, sweet smell of mice. For a long moment, she just stood there, letting her eyes adjust. Thin blades of light pierced the gloom through cracks in the walls and roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. Slowly, the cavernous space resolved itself. A long counter ran the length of the room, coated in a blanket of gray dust so thick it softened every edge. Behind it, shelves stood empty and skeletal. A few overturned barrels lay on their sides, and in the center of the room, a pot-bellied stove stood like a silent, squat god of a forgotten religion. Everything was draped in cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds. It was worse than she had imagined. The scale of the dereliction was overwhelming, a physical weight in the stale air. This wasn't a store. It was a grave. And she had paid $3 to be its keeper. What secret could be hiding in a place everyone had given up on? Was Hattie Mercer a fool, driven by grief to purchase a tomb? Or did she see something no one else could? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and the quiet courage of those who find them. Now, as the sun began to set on her first day as a property owner, the town began to whisper, and not all the voices were kind. The whispers started before Hattie had even cleared the dust from her throat. As she forced the front door open from the inside, the shriek of rusted hinges carrying across the deserted street, she felt the eyes of Renner upon her. The townspeople, a scattered chorus of ranchers, shopkeepers, and idle hands, watched from the shade of their own porches. They saw a lone woman, covered in grime and cobwebs, wrestling with the ghost of a dead enterprise. They saw a fool. Their pity from the morning had curdled into a kind of soft, communal mockery. "Poor thing," a woman murmured from the doorway of the seamstress shop. "Grief's made her lose her senses." Another man, loading supplies into a wagon, just shook his head slowly, a sad smile on his face. Then came a voice that was neither soft nor pitying. "Well, look what the cat dragged in, or what dragged itself in." Silas Croft, the town's undisputed king, stood in front of the saloon, his thumbs hooked in the pockets of a brocade vest that seemed too fine for the dusty street. Croft owned the largest ranch, held the note on half the businesses in town, and moved with the unthinking arrogance of a man who had never been told no. His face was fleshy and prosperous, his eyes small and shrewd. He looked from Hattie to the derelict store and let out a short, barking laugh. Trying to squeeze blood from a stone, little lady? Renner himself couldn't make a go of it when the railroad left. You'd have better luck planting corn in this street. His men chuckled along with him, a loyal, rumbling echo. Hattie met his gaze for a moment, her face impassive, then turned back to her work, her silence a better reply than any words she could muster. His laughter followed her into the store, a sharp, ugly sound that seemed to stain the air. Later that afternoon, as Hattie was sweeping a small corner of the floor, another figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. Ilara was her name, a woman who had been in Renner since it was just a crossroads and a well. She had known the store's previous owner, the reclusive Mr. Renner, better than anyone. She stepped just inside, her gaze sweeping the dusty interior not with pity, but with a strange, intense focus. "Heard you bought it," she said, her voice dry as a cicada's shell. Hattie nodded, leaning on her broom. "Yes, ma'am." Ilara's eyes fixed on the long, unbroken wall behind the main counter. "Be careful what you tear down," the old woman said, her voice dropping to a low, weighted murmur. "Some walls are built to keep things in, not just to keep people out." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Hattie alone with the dust and the cryptic warning. The words settled in the quiet room, nonsensical and unsettling, another layer of mystery laid over the decay. What could a wall possibly keep in? The question hung in the air, as tangible as the thick, undisturbed dust. The first few days were a battle of attrition, Hattie against the accumulated neglect of a decade. Her world shrank to the four walls of the store, her life measured in buckets of dirty water and piles of debris. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a grim determination and the last of her dried biscuit and jerky. Her first priority was survival. She needed firewood for the pot-bellied stove to ward off the chill of the high desert nights, and a clean space to lay her bedroll. The rotten shelving that lined the walls, once home to tins of coffee and bolts of calico, would serve her purpose. She started at the front, prying the splintered planks from the walls with a crowbar she'd found rusting in a back corner. It was her late husband's. She remembered the weight of it in his hands, the easy strength with which he'd mended their fences. Now, in her own small, chapped hands, it felt impossibly heavy, a tool for dismantling rather than building. She worked her way methodically down the long right-hand wall. The wood came away with groans of protest, revealing the rough-hewn oak planks of the store's frame beneath. The air filled with the scent of dry rot and ancient dust. As she worked, the store began to breathe again, the light from the now unboarded windows reaching corners that hadn't seen the sun in years. Yet the place felt more empty, not less. The skeletal shelves had at least suggested a purpose, a memory of function. Now there were just bare, stained walls. The disappointment was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. Silas Croft's mocking laughter echoed in her memory. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps she was just a fool, tidying up a tomb. On the third day, she slept inside for the first time, having cleared a space near the stove. The night was filled with the creaks and groans of the old building settling around her. It sounded like a sleeping giant, its snores the whisper of wind through the cracks, its sighs the settling of ancient beams. At one point she was startled awake by a scratching sound. Not the familiar scuttling of a mouse, but something else. A rhythmic scraping noise coming from the back of the store. She sat up, her heart pounding in the darkness, clutching the heavy crowbar. She listened, every sense on edge. The sound stopped. She told herself it was just the wind, a loose branch scraping against the outer wall, but a seed of unease was planted. The building had secrets, and they were beginning to stir. She lay awake for a long time, staring into the oppressive darkness, feeling for the first time that she was not entirely alone in the cavernous space. The silence that followed was heavier, more watchful than before. The next morning, Hattie moved her work to the long back wall behind the main counter. This was the spine of the store, a solid, windowless expanse of wood. The shelving here was sturdier, built of thick pine to hold the weight of heavy sacks of flour and sugar. As she began to pry the first rotten shelf away from its supports, she felt an unusual resistance. The nails holding the brackets were driven deep. It took all her strength, leveraging the crowbar with a grunt, to pull one free. It came away with a loud crack, and the shelf sagged. Behind it, the wall was dark with age and grime. She continued her work, moving down the line, dismantling the structure that had once been the heart of Renner's commerce. It felt like sacrilege, but it was necessary. She needed firewood more than she needed the ghosts of commerce. It was when she reached the middle section of the wall that she first noticed the anomaly. After pulling away a particularly stubborn set of shelves, she ran her hand over the wall behind it, checking for loose splinters, and she felt it. A subtle but distinct difference in the texture of the wood. She stepped back and looked closer. For a section about 6 feet wide, stretching from floor to ceiling, the planks were not the same dark, weathered oak as the rest of the wall. They were pine, lighter in color, and the vertical seams between them were tighter, cleaner. It looked newer, as if this one section had been repaired or replaced. But why? There was no sign of damage, no water stains from a leak in the roof above. It was a patch of new skin on an old body. Curiosity piqued. She leaned in, examining the nails that held these pine planks in place. Her breath caught in her throat. The nails were wrong. On all the other walls, the hand-forged nail heads were visible, hammered in from the main room. But on this section, there were no heads. Instead, she could see the sharp, pointed ends of the nails sticking out of the wood, their tips glinting faintly in the dusty light. They had been hammered in from the other side, from inside the wall. It made no sense. You couldn't build a wall from the inside out. You couldn't nail yourself into a space. A chill, entirely separate from the morning air, traced its way down her spine. She remembered the old woman's words. Some walls are built to keep things in. She stood there for a long time, staring at the strange, seamless patch of wood, the crowbar hanging forgotten in her hand. The simple task of gathering firewood had just become something else entirely. The wall was a locked door, and the key was a secret she could not yet guess. For the rest of the day, Hattie tried to ignore the wall. She told herself it was a strange repair, a quirk of a long-dead builder. She swept, she cleaned, she organized the few salvageable items she'd found. A handful of empty glass jars, a rusted coffee grinder, a chipped enamel basin. But her eyes kept drifting back to that smooth, seamless patch of pine. The image of the nail points sticking out was burned into her mind. It was a physical impossibility, a riddle posed in wood and iron. The store, which had felt merely empty, now felt watchful. The secret it held was no longer passive. It was waiting. That evening, as she ate her meager meal of beans by the light of a single lantern, the wall seemed to loom in the darkness, a silent dare. The next morning, she abandoned all other work. The wall was an obsession. It had to be opened. She gathered her tools, the crowbar and a heavy mallet she'd found. She stood before the pine planks, the place where her labor had stopped the day before. Her hands, already calloused and blistered, felt the grain of the wood. It was smoother than the rest of the building, the work of a careful hand. As she examined the floorboards in front of the strange section, she noticed another clue. Faint, parallel scratches ran across the wood, nearly obscured by a decade of dust. They were the marks of something heavy being dragged away from the wall, not pushed against it. Someone had moved a large cabinet or counter to access this spot, and then moved it back. This wasn't a repair. It was a concealment. She placed the tip of the crowbar into the tight seam between two of the pine planks and struck the end with the mallet. The sound was a dull thud that echoed in the cavernous room. It was slow, arduous work. The boards were fitted together with precision, and the nails on the other side held them fast. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the grime. Splinters dug into her palms. With every blow of the mallet, a small piece of the mystery chipped away. She was no longer just a widow clearing a derelict store. She was an archaeologist, excavating a forgotten history. A memory of Daniel surfaced, unbidden. He was showing her how to split logs, his voice patient. "Let the tool do the work, Hat. Find the grain, don't fight it, persuade it." She repositioned the crowbar, feeling for the path of least resistance. She wasn't fighting the wall anymore. She was asking it to tell her its secret. Finally, with a loud groan of tortured wood, the first plank began to give way. She worked the crowbar deeper, leveraging it with her entire body. The nails on the other side scraped as they pulled free, a high, piercing shriek. The board came loose at the top, and she pulled it away. A wave of stale, utterly motionless air washed over her face. It was the air of a sealed tomb, dry and dead. She peered into the sliver of profound darkness she had created. She could see nothing. The space beyond was absolute black. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. She had breached the barrier. She had opened the thing that was meant to stay shut. Working faster now, driven by a mixture of fear and relentless curiosity, she attacked the next board, and the next. The pile of pine planks grew at her feet. The opening widened, a dark mouth in the center of the store. When she had removed the last one, she stood back, panting, and raised her lantern to the void. She held the lantern high, its trembling golden light pushing back against a decade of darkness. The beam fell upon a small, windowless room, no larger than a pantry. The air that flowed out was dry as bone, carrying the scent of paper and leather and time itself. Her first glance took in stacks of paper, neatly bundled with twine and piled on the floor. At the top of the nearest pile, the ornate script was unmistakable: "Bonds of the Confederate States of America." Hattie's shoulders slumped. Her frantic, hopeful work had uncovered a fool's treasure, worthless paper. The last, desperate gamble of a lost cause, hidden away by a man who couldn't accept defeat. It was a fitting secret for a dying town. For a moment, she felt nothing but the sharp, bitter sting of disappointment. All that work for a pile of expensive kindling. But her lantern light probed deeper into the small space. Behind the stacks of useless bonds, something else rested against the back wall. A heavy iron strongbox, its surface dark with a thin layer of dust. It wasn't large, but it was solid, its presence radiating a sense of weight and importance. There was no visible lock, just a heavy latch. With her heart beginning to pound a new, hopeful rhythm, Hattie squeezed into the narrow room and knelt before it. The latch was stiff but not sealed. She lifted it, the metallic click echoing in the confined space, and raised the heavy lid. The light of her lantern fell inside and shattered into 100 dazzling points of gold. Stacked in neat columns were U.S. gold coins, double eagles, eagles, half eagles. It was a fortune. More money than she had ever seen, more than she could have imagined. Enough to leave Renner, to start a new life anywhere she chose, to wash away the poverty and the grief in a river of gold. She stared, mesmerized, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something else tucked beside the coins. A thick, leather-bound ledger and a slim document portfolio tied with a ribbon. Her hands shaking, she set the gold aside and reached for the papers. The portfolio first. Inside, she found an assortment of documents, but one, on top, made the blood run cold in her veins. It was a bill of sale, dated 1858, for a family, a man, a woman, and their 2 children, named Dubois. It was a relic of a world that was supposed to be dead and buried. But tucked within its folds was a more recent, handwritten letter. It was a draft, written in the meticulous script of Mr. Renner. It was addressed to Silas Croft. The letter was a careful, veiled threat, referencing the Dubois family and a parcel of land they had been granted after emancipation. Land that Croft's family had then reacquired through a series of suspect legal challenges. Renner knew the claim was fraudulent. He had the proof. He had been blackmailing the wealthiest man in town. Her hands trembling, Hattie opened the ledger. She had kept the books for her and Daniel's small farm, and her mind, trained in the simple, honest arithmetic of seed and harvest, immediately recognized the landscape of deceit. It was Croft's shadow ledger, meticulously maintained by Renner. Page after page detailed fraudulent loans to struggling farmers, with exorbitant interest rates. It documented land purchases for fractions of their worth, secured with forged signatures. It was the secret blueprint of Silas Croft's empire, a testament to a fortune built on stolen land and manufactured debt. The gold in the strongbox was life-changing. But this ledger was a weapon. It was justice, bound in leather. Hattie finally understood. The wall wasn't built to hide a treasure. It was built to contain a truth so powerful it could unmake the man who owned the town. And now she was its keeper. The weight of the ledger in her lap felt heavier than all the gold in the strongbox combined. For 2 days, Hattie did nothing. She sealed the hidden room back up, propping the pine boards in place, and went about her work in a daze. The knowledge she possessed was a living thing, a coiled serpent in the heart of her store. The gold promised escape, a future free from want. The ledger promised something far more dangerous, a reckoning. Every time she saw Silas Croft swaggering across the street from the saloon, his presence a heavy shadow over the town, she felt a tremor of fear. To use the ledger was to declare war on a king in his own kingdom. Word of her slow, steady work on the store had spread. The quiet mockery of the townspeople was shifting to a grudging curiosity. Where was this penniless widow getting the strength, the will? The question eventually reached Croft himself. He began to watch her, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. He saw the new light in her windows, the slow but steady clearing of debris. He saw a project that should have been abandoned in days stretching into a week, then 2. Suspicion, like a weed, began to take root in his mind. What had the old fool Renner left behind? One evening, 2 of Croft's ranch hands appeared at her door. They were large men, their faces hard and unsmiling. They didn't threaten her, not directly. They offered to help her clear the rest of the store, to haul away any old junk she might have found. Their eyes roamed the interior, lingering on the back wall. Hattie, her heart pounding, politely refused their offer. They left, but the message was clear. Croft was sniffing around. He knew something was here. That night, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray. A blue norther blew in, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in as many minutes. The wind howled around the corners of the old store, a mournful, angry sound. Rain came down in solid driving sheets, drumming against the roof and finding its way through a dozen small leaks. The storm was a perfect mirror of the tempest in Hattie's soul. As the storm reached its zenith, she heard a splintering crash from the street, followed by a desperate shout. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw it. A wagon, its axle snapped, lay helpless in the churning mud of the street. A man and a woman were struggling to control a panicked horse, while a small child wailed from beneath the inadequate cover of the wagon's canvas. Without a second thought, Hattie threw the door open, the wind nearly tearing it from her grasp. "In here!" she yelled over the roar of the storm. "Bring the child in here!" The man, his face etched with worry, looked at her with gratitude and surprise. He lifted his feverish son from the wagon and carried him inside, his wife following close behind. Hattie led them to the driest corner near the stove, giving them her own blanket to wrap the boy in. As the woman murmured her thanks, she introduced herself. Her name was Sarah Dubois. Her husband was Joseph. They were on their way to a new settlement, hoping to start over. The name struck Hattie like a physical blow. Dubois. These were the descendants of the family in the bill of sale. Fate, it seemed, had come knocking on her door in the middle of a storm. From the saloon across the street, she could see the faint glow of lanterns. Croft's men were watching. They would see her giving shelter to this family. They would report it back. In that moment, Hattie made her choice. The gold was an abstraction. This family was real. Their history was in her hands. She was no longer just the keeper of a secret. She was the steward of a debt. The ledger was not for her. It was for them. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet. Joseph Dubois, a man whose hands were as calloused as Hattie's, managed to brace his wagon's broken axle, and by mid-morning, the family was preparing to leave. Before they went, Sarah Dubois pressed a small, carved wooden bird into Hattie's hand. "It's not much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's all we have to offer. Thank you." Hattie looked at the simple, beautiful object, then at the hopeful, tired faces of the family. She knew what she had to do. The risk no longer mattered. Later that day, Silas Croft appeared. He didn't send his men this time. He came himself. He strode into the store, his boots making clean prints in the thin layer of dust Hattie hadn't yet swept. He feigned a neighborly concern, his voice a slick balm of false cordiality. "Miss Mercer," he began, his eyes scanning the room, "I see you're making real progress here, a testament to your spirit." He paused, letting the flattery hang in the air. "But this is too much for a woman alone. I'll make you a fair offer. $500, cash, for the building and everything in it. A chance for you to start fresh somewhere new." It was a fortune, an unimaginable sum. It was also an admission. He knew she'd found something, and he wanted to bury it. Hattie looked at him, her expression calm. The fear she had felt for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "It's not for sale, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but firm. His smile tightened. "Don't be a fool, girl. There's nothing here for you." "I think there is," she replied. That was all. She didn't accuse him, didn't reveal her hand. She just stood her ground. He stared at her for a long moment, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the raw menace beneath. Then he turned on his heel and left. The war had been declared. That afternoon, Hattie packed a small bag. In it, she placed the ledger, the portfolio of documents, and the small wooden bird. She wouldn't be safe in Renner. The nearest county seat, with a federal marshal and a circuit judge not on Croft's payroll, was a day's ride away. As she was preparing to leave, a wagon pulled up outside. It was Joseph Dubois. He had seen Croft leave her store, had seen the look on his face. "You're in trouble, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "It ain't right for you to face it alone." He insisted on escorting her. Hattie, who had felt utterly alone for 2 years, found her eyes welling with tears. She accepted. The circuit judge was a man named Elias Thorne, gray-haired and weary from decades of witnessing the worst of human nature. He listened to Hattie's story patiently, his face betraying no emotion. Then, he opened the ledger. He spent nearly an hour poring over the pages, his finger tracing the lines of meticulous script. He cross-referenced names and dates with documents from his own files. Finally, he looked up at Hattie, his eyes holding a new light of profound respect. "This is Mr. Renner's hand, no doubt," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And this is the most complete record of systematic fraud I have ever seen." He looked at Joseph Dubois, then back at Hattie. "You have done a very brave and very dangerous thing, Miss Mercer." Justice, it turned out, had a quiet, methodical voice. The town's reckoning was about to begin. News travels slowly on foot, but with the authority of a federal marshal, it travels like lightning. The marshal arrived in Renner 2 days later, and with him, the truth. It didn't come as a dramatic accusation shouted in the street, but as a series of quiet official visits. He knocked on the doors of farmers who had lost their land to Croft, of shopkeepers who were drowning in his debt. He showed them the entries in Renner's ledger, the proof of the theft they had always suspected, but could never prove. A dam of fear and silence that had held for 20 years finally broke. One by one, people found their voices. The whispers that had once mocked Hattie now turned against Croft. The chorus of the townspeople, once unified in their dismissal of her, now found a new harmony in their shared vindication. Silas Croft was not arrested. There was no shootout, no dramatic confrontation in the saloon. His downfall was quieter and far more complete. His power was built on the illusion of legitimacy and the reality of debt. When the ledger was made public, both pillars crumbled. The federal court placed liens on all his land holdings pending investigation. The bank in the county seat called in his loans. The men who had worked for him, sensing the shift in the wind, simply drifted away. He was not ruined by a bullet, but by the undeniable truth of a dead man's accounting. The town watched as he became, in the space of a week, just a man. A man with a fine vest and a house of cards that had just been blown over by the patient, persistent work of a quiet widow. The townspeople began to see Hattie differently. They no longer saw a foolish girl, but a woman of immense strength. They would stop by the store, not yet to buy anything, for she had nothing to sell, but to thank her. An old rancher, a man who had lost his prime grazing land to Croft a decade earlier, stood on her porch, hat in his hands, and simply said, "Thank you, ma'am. You gave us our story back." Hattie, in breaking the town's great secret, had healed a wound they had forgotten was even there. She had not just exposed a thief, she had restored the town's memory of itself, of what was right and what was stolen. Her $3 purchase had bought back its soul. By the time the first chill of autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek bed yellow, the Shuttered General Store was open for business. The gold from the strongbox, which Hattie had reported to Judge Thorne, and which he had designated a portion of as a finder's reward, had been put to use. Not for lavish new fixtures or a fancy sign, but for good, solid repairs, and a stock of essential goods: flour, coffee, beans, salt, nails, and bolts of sturdy cloth. The store was not grand, but it was clean, warm, and honest. The bell above the door, once silent, now jingled a half-dozen times a day, a cheerful, hopeful sound on the quiet street. The Dubois family, their ancestral land claim restored by the court, were thriving. Their farm, just a few miles from town, was already known for the best melons in the county. They were Hattie's first and most loyal customers. Their weekly visit a cornerstone of the store's new life. Other families, their fraudulent debts to Croft, erased by the ledger's truth, were slowly getting back on their feet. The town wasn't booming, but it was breathing again. The tired, defeated air had been replaced by a quiet, determined industry. One evening at dusk, Hattie stood on the newly repaired porch, watching the last light paint the sky in shades of orange and rose. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke. Joseph Dubois was loading supplies into his wagon, his children chasing a stray dog in the street. He paused and nodded toward the store, its windows glowing with the warm, inviting light of a lantern. "You brought more than goods back to this town, Miss Hattie," he said, his voice sincere. You brought back a sense of what's right. Hattie looked past him to the main street of Renner, where lights were now appearing in windows that had been dark for years. On a shelf behind her counter, the old ledger sat, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder. She thought of the gold, most of which was now funding legal aid for other families wronged by men like Croft, and the small, simple life she was building. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and said, more to herself than to him, "I didn't find a treasure. I just found the receipts." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. Hattie Mercer learned that the greatest inheritance is not what you are given, but what you choose to set right. If you were moved by her story, please leave a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more tales of hidden history, and we'll see you again next time.